Okay, norm reference data. In this section, we're going to be talking about the technical stuff that has to do with norm reference testing. So, first of all, you need to think about what are protocols. Now, a protocol, while it's a process, it can be a process. In testing, we call the testing protocol. It's a form, okay? It's not, step 1, step 2, step 3, which that also can be seen as a protocol, but the testing protocol itself is the form that you write everything down on. So, generally speaking, student answers are scored as a series of 1s and 0s for correct and incorrect in the protocol. Now you have to be very careful about this. You want to make sure that they do not watch your pencil. So what I found to be very, very useful is to use a pencil that's, one of those short pencils. It's a lot more difficult for them to be able to see what you're doing, and to do everything with a clipboard that you can keep tilted up. That way, that, in one of the sections I've told you, that the issue of having motivation high. Now, what if we're giving rewards? Well, in that section, I told you to make sure that when you give a positive comment, that you're not commenting on the answer itself, but on the activity. So you're not going to tell them, great answer. Well, yes, you can say great answer, but you're not going to say, oh, that was the right answer. No. You're not going to tell them, good choice. You're going to say, good try. Or, you're working really hard. It's the same thing with your pencil. You don't want them watching it, because and your older children will catch on to this very, very quickly. When you write a 1, it looks very different than when you write a 0 when someone is watching you. And so you have to be very careful that they cannot see your pencil. So, in one way, it sounds like, okay, we need to keep everything really secret, but we're actually protecting the student from giving what they might perceive as answers that you want instead of answers that they really understand. So we're really trying to protect them. And also be sure that you read that manual regarding subtests, because in many of them, in the book, it goes over this about basals and ceilings. And many protocols are very, very particular about what age you start at, where you stop at, what kinds of basal and ceiling limits you're going to have. So you need to be very, very careful about reading that manual. Now, the derived scores. Derived scores are those scores that we've manipulated. Okay, they started out as raw scores, but raw scores are then transformed through standard deviations and other types of formulas into derived scores. And that standard deviation, what we call that SD or the alpha, that's a derived score. So then we have advantages and there's disadvantages to using different types of scores. And that's why it's very important for you to understand the numerical scales that those scores are representing. Because you wouldn't want to talk about an interval score in the same way that you would talk about a ratio score. So you need to understand the differences between those two, because whenever you're reading it in a report, especially say you're reading an assessment report that has been conducted and completed, you're reading that report and you're reading these scores. You want to know what kind of scale that they were talking about so that you have a good understanding of what actually happened in that test experience. Now, here's the types of scores again. We have the average, your standard score. And standard score, you have an average of 100. T-scores, an average of 50 with a standard deviation of 10. A Z-score, and remember those are in one single digit increments. Stanine scores, those are distributed into 9 segments. It's not used a whole lot except in the annual testing that, like the ISTEP, they're going to use Stanine scores. A scaled score and T-scores are highly related. Often we'll see a T-score with a scaled score, and you'll see this especially in like the key math and the GORT. You're going to see some of these things where you're going to see both areas. T-scores, often we use those also with psychological testing, and so whenever you're reading one of those reports, you're going to see T-scores, and so you need to remember that your average score is 50, and generally speaking, if it's a psychological test, the higher the score, the more severe the problem. With academic tests, the higher the score, the better the situation. So you just have to make sure that that you keep those in mind. But back to percentile ranks down here. A percentile and a percentage, again, remember, they are different. A percentage is it's basically what percent correct did you get on the whole test. So it's based on 100. But a percentile is based on everybody who took it and what rank are you in relationship to other students. Then you have the age equivalent. And the age equivalent is very important because that is actually the score that you want to look at. Because age is not something that you can control or that can be controlled by someone else. This is not a controllable variable. But those kids, when you have an age equivalent, you're looking at how student A, who might have a disability, compared to student B, who has been diagnosed as having a disability, to student C, who has not been given any diagnosis whatsoever, to student D, who might have a gifted IQ. So the age equivalent tells you exactly where they're at according to their age range. And so you have a much better chance of having it more balanced out. Grade equivalence, however, what if you have a child that is in 4th grade but has repeated a grade? Then that grade equivalent might be skewed a bit. That's why we want to use the age equivalence. So then, looking at this interpolating data, test developers obtain average expected scores for each month that they're working on, developing the test by interpolating the data. So they divide the existing data into smaller units, so maybe into stanines, to establish a developmental score. And then those scores are written by using decimals. The scores can also be divided by age group, so that each month has a different chronological age. And you're going to see this, and this is very, very important because we have to know exactly how old that child is. So the student's age is going to be expressed in years, months, and days, and the scores are written using a dash. So, and we're going to talk about how we go about doing this.